The message arrived through official channels, stamped with the seal of the Galactic Council. Diplomats on Earth expected the usual requests when alien species made contact. They expected demands for resources. They expected trade negotiations. They expected territorial discussions or technology exchanges. What they received instead left the entire diplomatic corps stunned into silence. The hegemony was asking for therapists. Admiral read the translated message 3 times before she believed it. They were among the most feared military powers in known space. Their soldiers had conquered 3 star systems. Their generals had never lost a major campaign. Their empire stretched across dozens of worlds, built on the backs of warriors who knew nothing but victory. And now they were reaching out to humanity, a species that had never left its own solar system, asking for help with something they could not name. The request described symptoms that human psychologists recognized immediately: soldiers who could not sleep, veterans who flinched at loud noises years after their last battle, warriors who had won every fight but could not stop fighting in their own minds. They had no words for what was happening to their people. They only knew that their greatest heroes were breaking apart, and no one understood why. 3 months after the initial contact, Commander arrived on Earth as the first veteran to participate in the exchange program. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, her body covered in dark chitinous plates that gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the United Nations building. Her service record showed campaigns across a dozen worlds. She had led the final assault on Prime. She was considered one of the greatest military minds her species had ever produced. She also had not slept more than 2 hours at a time in over a year. Doctor met her in a small conference room on the 43rd floor. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair and calm eyes that had seen decades of human suffering. He had worked with soldiers from every conflict Earth had produced in the last 30 years. He had sat with veterans of desert wars and jungle campaigns and urban sieges. He had heard confessions of violence and guilt and shame that would have broken lesser minds. Nothing about the alien warrior sitting across from him surprised him. The translator device between them hummed softly as spoke. Her voice was deep and resonant, produced by vocal structures completely unlike human anatomy. But the words she said, once translated, were achingly familiar. She told Doctor about the nightmares. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back on Prime. She could smell the burning atmosphere. She could hear the screams of the enemy soldiers as her forces pushed through their final defensive line. She could see the faces of the ones she had killed personally, clear as if they were standing before her now. She told him about the hypervigilance. She could not enter a room without mapping every exit. She could not sit with her back to a door. She could not hear a sudden noise without her body preparing for combat, muscles tensing, hearts racing, every sense straining for threats that were not there. She told him about the guilt. This was the part she understood least of all. She had done nothing wrong. Every action she took was in service to her people. Every enemy she killed was an enemy who would have killed her soldiers if given the chance. The war was just. The victory was complete. And yet something inside her screamed that she had committed unforgivable sins. Doctor listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, silence hung between them for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised her completely. He nodded and said he understood. Not that he understood intellectually, not that he had read about such things in books. He told her that he had heard these same words from human soldiers for 20 years. He told her that what she was experiencing had a name. Humans called it post-traumatic stress disorder. It was not a disease of the body. It was a wound of the mind, invisible, but just as real as any battlefield injury. Felt something shift inside her at those words. For months, she had believed she was defective. She had believed that something fundamental had broken in her, something that made her weak when she should be strong. They did not have concepts for psychological wounds. A warrior was either victorious or dead. There was no room in their culture for someone who had won every battle but was losing a war inside her own skull. But humans knew. Humans understood. This small species, trapped on a single world, fighting only among themselves, had somehow developed an entire science around the invisible wounds of combat. Doctor explained that humans had been studying this phenomenon for over a century. It had gone by different names over the years: shell shock, combat fatigue, battle neurosis. Eventually, human doctors had realized that they were all describing the same fundamental injury. The mind, pushed beyond its limits by the horrors of war, began to function as if the war had never ended. He told her about the treatments humans had developed: talk therapy, where veterans learned to process their experiences rather than suppress them; medication that could help regulate the brain chemistry disrupted by trauma; group sessions where soldiers could share their burdens with others who truly understood. None of it was perfect. Healing was slow and difficult and sometimes incomplete, but it was possible. Asked why humans had developed such sophisticated approaches to this problem, the answer, Doctor explained, was simple and tragic. Humans had been traumatizing each other in warfare for thousands of years. Every generation had sent young people into combat and then watched them struggle to return to normal life. Humans had no choice but to develop ways to help them. The irony struck like a physical blow. Her people had conquered star systems. They had developed weapons that could destroy planets. They had built ships that could cross the galaxy in weeks. And yet they had no framework for understanding why their greatest heroes came home haunted by what they had done. Meanwhile, humans, confined to a single world, perpetually at war with themselves, had learned something that all the advanced species of the galaxy had missed. They had learned that the mind could be wounded just as surely as the body, and they had learned how to heal those wounds. Doctor offered to work with her personally. He would help her understand what she was experiencing. He would teach her techniques for managing the symptoms. He would not promise that she would ever fully recover, but he promised that she would not have to face this alone. Agreed. She did not know what else to do. Her own people had no answers. Their doctors had scanned her brain and found nothing wrong. Their officers had told her to simply be stronger. Their priests had suggested that she was being punished for some unknown sin. None of them understood that she was carrying wounds that no scanner could detect. In the weeks that followed, word of the program spread through diplomatic channels. Other veterans began requesting to participate. Other species started paying attention. The Galactic Council, which had largely ignored humanity as a minor species with no strategic importance, suddenly found its assessments. Humanity had nothing to offer in terms of military technology. Their weapons were primitive by galactic standards. Their ships were slow and fragile, but they possessed knowledge that no other species had ever developed. They understood the true cost of war, not just in bodies and resources, but in the minds and spirits of those who fought it. And they knew how to help. Doctor stayed late in his office the night after his first session with. He looked out at the city lights below and thought about the strange turn history had taken. Humanity's first major contribution to galactic civilization would not be technology or resources or military might. It would be something far more humble and far more profound. It would be the simple act of understanding. The treatment center orbited, a neutral station where beings from across the galaxy could meet on equal terms. 6 months after the program began, its halls had become something unprecedented in galactic history. The most fearsome warriors in known space gathered there not to fight, but to heal. Doctor had been among the first wave of human counselors assigned to the station. She was younger than Doctor, still in her 30s, with dark skin and patient eyes that invited trust. She had spent years working with veterans on Earth before volunteering for this assignment. Nothing in that experience had fully prepared her for what she encountered here. There were massive beings, their bodies armored with plates of chitin that could stop small-caliber bullets. Their eyes were compound structures that perceived the world in ways humans could barely imagine. Their voices resonated at frequencies that made human bones vibrate. Everything about them seemed designed for war. And yet, when they spoke about their experiences, they sounded exactly like the soldiers' doctor had treated back home. She learned to read their body language over time. The flattening of antennae against the skull indicated distress. The clicking of mandibles was their version of holding back tears. The way they curled their clawed hands into fists meant they were fighting the urge to flee. Different bodies, different cultures, different wars, but the same fundamental wounds. The other human counselors reported similar observations. James, a former Marine sergeant who had transitioned into therapy after his own recovery from PTSD, was particularly effective with the soldiers. He understood them in ways that pure academics never could. He had walked the same dark paths they were walking now. The breakthrough came during a group session 3 months into the program. Was working with a group of 8 veterans, all of whom had served in the final campaign against the Collective. They were among the most decorated soldiers in their empire's history. They were also among the most damaged. The session had stalled. They were speaking in the abstract, discussing their symptoms as if they were happening to someone else. They had been trained since childhood to suppress emotion, to present strength at all times. Opening up to a human, a member of a species they had never even heard of a year ago, felt like the ultimate weakness. Made a decision that violated standard protocol. He stopped asking questions. Instead, he shared his own story. He told them about. He described the day the improvised explosive device detonated under the vehicle in front of his. He named the 3 Marines who died in that blast. He described the way their bodies looked when the dust cleared, images that still visited him in his nightmares 15 years later. He told them about the years that followed, the drinking that started as a way to sleep and became a way to survive, the relationships he destroyed because he could not let anyone close, the night he sat alone in his apartment with his service weapon in his hand, trying to find a reason not to pull the trigger. He told them what saved him, a friend who refused to give up on him, a therapist who understood because she had served too, a group of fellow veterans who showed him that healing was possible, even when it felt impossible. When he finished speaking, silence filled the room. They stared at him with their compound eyes, processing what they had just heard. This small, fragile human had walked through the same darkness they were experiencing. He had survived. He had recovered enough to spend his life helping others. Then slowly one of them began to speak. His name was, and he had led an assault company during the Siege of Prime. He described the orders he had followed. Advance over the bodies of fallen comrades. Do not stop for anything. Push forward until the enemy breaks. He described what he saw during that advance. His own soldiers dying beside him, their lives spent to gain meters of ground. Enemy soldiers who threw down their weapons and begged for mercy, only to be cut down because there was no time to take prisoners. Civilians caught in the crossfire, their bodies scattered across streets they would never walk again. He described the medal ceremony afterward, the praise heaped upon him for his bravery and determination, the promotion that recognized his service to the empire, and he described the emptiness he felt while everyone celebrated, the knowledge that he had done terrible things and would never be able to undo them. When finished, another began to speak, then another. The dam had broken. For the first time, these warriors who had been taught to suppress all weakness were sharing the burdens they carried. They were discovering that they were not alone. News of the breakthrough spread quickly through the station. More veterans requested to join the sessions led by human counselors. Other species began sending observers to understand what was happening. The Combine, who had fought a brutal civil war 2 generations ago, asked if humanity could help their veterans as well. Doctor found herself leading sessions with beings whose biology was completely different from her own. They were aquatic creatures, their bodies flowing and changing shape as they moved through the liquid environment of their quarters. The crystalline consensus were synthetic beings, artificial intelligences housed in bodies of living crystal. None of them had lungs or hearts or brains that functioned like human organs, but all of them carried wounds that matched human trauma precisely. The veterans described flashbacks that disrupted their ability to function. The consensus units reported processing loops that replayed combat scenarios endlessly. They had different words for their experiences, filtered through different cultural frameworks. But the underlying reality was the same. War damaged minds, regardless of what form those minds took. Doctor, now serving as program director, presented his findings to the Galactic Council. He explained that humans had no special resistance to psychological trauma. They suffered just as greatly as any other species. The difference was that humanity had been forced to confront this reality long ago. Humans had been waging war on each other for thousands of years. Every generation had watched its young people return from battle forever changed. Every society had struggled with veterans who could not readjust to peaceful life. Over time, humans had no choice but to develop systems for helping them. The council members listened with expressions that ranged from surprise to shame. Their civilizations had conquered star systems. They had developed technologies that humans could barely comprehend, and yet they had missed something fundamental about the nature of conflict. They had counted the bodies and the resources spent. They had never thought to count the minds that were broken. Humanity, the primitive species confined to a single world, had discovered this truth centuries ago, and now they were teaching it to the galaxy. The program expanded rapidly. Training centers opened on a dozen worlds, where human counselors taught alien therapists how to treat their own people. Translations of human psychological texts became some of the most requested documents in galactic archives. Species that had viewed humanity as irrelevant suddenly found themselves seeking human expertise. But the most important changes happened in the quiet rooms where veterans sat across from counselors and spoke about things they had never spoken about before. Each session was a small act of healing. Each story shared was a burden lifted. Each tear shed, whether from human eyes or ducts or membranes, represented a wound beginning to close. The galaxy was learning what humanity had learned long ago. Victory was not the end of war. The true end came only when the warriors could finally put down their weapons, not just in their hands, but in their minds. And that process could take a lifetime. The memorial stood at the heart of the treatment center, where every patient would pass it on their way to sessions. It had been designed by artists from both Earth and a collaboration that would have seemed impossible just 5 years earlier. The sculpture showed two figures seated side by side, their bodies different in every way but their posture identical. They sat in shared silence, watching something only they could see. The plaque beneath it bore words in a dozen languages. The English version read, "Those who have seen may help those who have seen." Commander stood before the memorial on the morning of her graduation. She was completing her training to become a counselor, one of the first to master human therapeutic techniques. She would soon return to her to treat her own people, carrying knowledge that her civilization had never possessed. 5 years had passed since she first sat across from Doctor in that conference room on Earth. She still remembered the fear she had felt then, the shame of admitting weakness, the desperate hope that somehow this strange species might understand what she was experiencing. They had understood, and in the years since, they had taught her to understand as well. The nightmares still came sometimes. She still mapped exit routes when she entered rooms. She still heard the echoes of Prime when the station was quiet. But these experiences no longer controlled her. She had learned to carry them instead of being carried by them. Doctor was there for her graduation ceremony. He had aged visibly in the 5 years since they first met, his hair and his steps slower. But his eyes held the same calm wisdom that had first given hope. He had dedicated his life to healing the wounds of war, and now that mission had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined. The ceremony was small and simple. Received her certification from Doctor, who had become the program's lead instructor. A few dozen witnesses watched from seats arranged in a circle, humans and others all mixed together. The formalities took only minutes. What followed was more important, was introduced to her first patient. He was young by standards, barely past his first molt. His name was, and he had served in a border skirmish just 6 months ago. On paper, the conflict had been minor. A brief exchange of fire with raiders from the outer territories. 3 soldiers had died. The raiders had been destroyed. The border was secured. Had not slept properly since. Recognized everything about him. The rigid posture that was trying to project strength. The darting eyes that scanned constantly for threats. The shame that radiated from every movement. She had worn all of these symptoms herself, back when she believed she was the only one. They sat across from each other in a small room. The walls were painted in soft colors that research had shown reduced anxiety. The chairs were designed to accommodate anatomy. Everything about the space had been carefully planned to create a sense of safety. Began by telling that what he was experiencing had a name. She explained that others had felt this way before him. She described the path forward, acknowledging that it would be difficult but promising that it was possible. She watched his antennae slowly relax as she spoke. She saw some of the tension leave his shoulders. The simple knowledge that he was not alone, that his experiences were understood, was already beginning to help. Outside the treatment center, the galaxy continued its endless turning. Wars were fought and won and lost. Empires rose and fell. Species expanded across the stars or retreated into obscurity. The grand movements of history paid little attention to the small room where 2 sat together in shared understanding. But the healers knew that this was where the real work happened, not in the halls of power or the fields of battle, but in the quiet spaces where one being reached across the void to help another. Every session was an act of repair. Every story shared was a step toward wholeness. Every counselor who graduated carried the potential to help hundreds more. The humans had given the galaxy a gift beyond measure. Not technology or resources or military might, but something far more precious. They had shared the hard-won wisdom of a species that had been hurting itself for. They had taught the stars that wounds of the mind were real and that healing was possible. Doctor watched from the observation gallery as conducted her first session. He felt a profound sense of pride mixed with a familiar sadness. They would learn to heal their own now. The consensus and the dozens of other species would follow. Humanity's role would gradually shift from teacher to partner. But the work would never truly end. War was woven into the fabric of intelligent life. As long as beings fought each other, there would be those who carried wounds from the fighting. The need for healing would persist for as long as civilization itself. What gave hope was the knowledge that the healers would persist as well, would treat, and someday might treat others. The chain of healing would extend forward through generations and across species. Each link would be forged in the same way, one being who had seen helping another who had seen. The human counselors began their journey home that evening. Their work here was largely done. They had trained enough alien therapists to keep the program running without them. They would return to Earth and continue treating their own veterans, the men and women who still carried the weight of humanity's endless conflicts. But they left something behind that could never be taken away. They left the understanding that suffering was not weakness. They left the knowledge that minds could heal as surely as bodies. They left the simple, revolutionary idea that those who had been broken by war could be made whole again. The memorial in the center of the station would stand for centuries to come. Species that humanity would never meet would see the 2 figures sitting in shared silence. They would read the inscription and understand its meaning. They would know that somewhere in the galaxy's history, a small species from a single world had taught the stars how to heal. And in quiet rooms across 1,000 worlds, the healing would continue, one session at a time, one story at a time, one wound at a time, until the galaxy learned what humanity had learned so long ago, that the truest victory was not the end of war, but the beginning of peace within those who had fought it.